At 7:23 in the evening on October 14th, 1944, Obergefreiter Wilhelm Brenner stood outside the Lucky Star Tavern in Cherokee, Oklahoma, listening to country music bleed through the wooden door, trying to understand if this was a test or mercy. 26 years old, captured 8 weeks earlier in Normandy, transported across the Atlantic on a hospital ship that had actual bunks instead of cargo holds, expecting a prison camp that looked like the ones he had been warned about in Wehrmacht briefings. Wire cages, hostile civilians, revenge beatings. Instead, the American sergeant standing beside him, a man named Dalton Hayes, was holding the pub door open and gesturing for Brenner to enter. And Brenner had no idea what was happening. Hayes was smiling, not the smile of a man about to spring a trap, the smile of a man inviting guests into his home. Hayes had told Brenner and the other 8 Germans waiting outside that they were going to the Lucky Star for an evening beer. Supervised recreation. 2 hours. Back to camp by curfew. Brenner thought he had misunderstood the English. A pub. In the middle of a war. In the middle of enemy territory. The logic refused to connect. Prisoners did not visit pubs. Prisoners stayed behind wire. Prisoners counted days until repatriation or death. Prisoners did not drink beer with their captors in public establishments while civilians watched. But Hayes was holding the door open, waiting. Brenner looked at the other 8 Germans, young men like himself, tired faces, uncertain eyes, all of them wearing the same dark brown fatigues with the large circular PW patches sewn onto the back and legs. All of them standing on a street in Oklahoma trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been told about American brutality for the past 10 years. The last time Brenner had stood before a door like this, he had been in Normandy. August 19th, 1944. Dawn breaking over the Falaise pocket. Brenner's unit, the 12th SS Panzer Division, had been trapped for 6 days with diminishing supplies, constant aerial bombardment, and orders to hold position that everyone knew was suicide. The Canadian infantry broke through their line at 5:47 in the morning. Brenner and 87 other men dropped their weapons and raised their hands. They chose to live. Brenner had served in the Wehrmacht for 3 years. He had believed what they told him, that Germany was fighting for survival, that the Allies would execute prisoners, that surrender meant torture and slow death in camps designed to break men's spirits before breaking their bodies. He had believed this because believing it meant he could justify the things he had seen, the things he had done. But when the moment came when the Canadian rifles pointed at his chest and the choice became real, Brenner chose to live, and the shame of that choice had lived in his chest every day since. Not shame that he had surrendered, shame that he had wanted to surrender, that some part of him buried beneath years of propaganda and indoctrination had known the war was already lost and wanted to survive long enough to see what came after. The Canadians had been efficient. They disarmed the prisoners, separated officers from enlisted men, processed them through a field collection point where hundreds of German soldiers sat in muddy compounds waiting for trucks. Brenner spent 4 days at that collection point before being loaded onto a convoy heading north to the coast. The Channel crossing took 6 hours. The hospital ship carried 200 German prisoners below deck. The conditions were cramped, but not brutal. Too many bodies in too little space. The smell of diesel fuel and vomit. The constant anxiety that the ship might hit a mine without anyone topside knowing Germans were aboard. But the bunks were real. Metal frames with actual mattresses. Thin mattresses, hard mattresses, but mattresses. Not cargo netting, not bare deck plating. Brenner had expected to be shackled in a hold. Instead, he got a bunk and a wool blanket. The first contradiction between expectation and reality. When the ship docked at Dover on August 26th, Brenner had not eaten solid food in 3 days. British military police marched the prisoners onto trains. Brenner's group travelled north through Kent, through London's outskirts into the Midlands. The landscape changed. Coastal cliffs gave way to rolling farmland, villages with stone churches and thatched roofs. The countryside looked nothing like the bombed-out France Brenner had been defending. It looked peaceful, untouched, like war was something happening elsewhere to other people. They spent 3 days in a British transit camp near Liverpool. Clean barracks, hot showers, food that was rationed but adequate. Vegetable soup, brown bread, tea with milk. The same rations British civilians received under wartime restrictions. Not generous portions, but not starvation either. On September 2nd, they loaded onto a Liberty ship bound for New York. The Atlantic crossing took 12 days, rough seas, winter storms starting early. The ship pitched and rolled, men got sick, the hold smelled like salt water and bile. But again, bunks, blankets, meals twice a day. The crew treated them like cargo that needed to arrive intact, not like enemies that deserved suffering. Brenner spent most of the crossing on deck when weather allowed, watching the ocean, trying to understand what kind of country transported its prisoners on ships with bunks and blankets. Trying to reconcile the stories he had been told about American savagery with the reality of American logistics. The ship passed the Statue of Liberty on September 13th. Brenner saw it through morning fog, the torch raised high. The woman's face turned toward the harbour. He had seen photographs in German newspapers before the war, propaganda about American decadence, American weakness, American degeneracy masked as freedom. But standing on the deck of a prisoner transport looking at that statue through Atlantic fog, Brenner felt something he had not expected to feel, something that made him ashamed all over again. Hope. They docked at Brooklyn. American military police processed them through a transit center. More photographs, more fingerprints, medical examinations, delousing. They were issued American uniforms. Surplus army fatigues dyed dark brown with PW patches, canvas shoes, wool socks, metal canteen cups, actual shoes, not wooden clogs, socks without holes, then trains. Across America, 4 days, New York to Chicago, Chicago to Kansas City, Kansas City to Oklahoma. Brenner watched the country pass through the windows. Farmland stretching to horizons, towns with paved streets and electric lights, people who looked well-fed, cars that ran, trains that arrived on time. Germany had been at war for 5 years, rationing, shortages, bombed cities, hungry civilians, trains that no longer ran because the tracks had been destroyed or the locomotives had been requisitioned for military transport. America looked like a country that had never heard of war. The train arrived at Camp Alva on September 14, 1944. Afternoon. Hot Oklahoma sun beating down on flat prairie landscape. Brenner stepped off the train and saw wooden barracks arranged in neat rows. A baseball field, a mess hall with smoke rising from the chimney. Guard towers, yes, but guards who looked bored rather than hostile. 80 acres of requisitioned farmland 3 miles south of the town of Alva. Constructed in 1943 as a temporary holding facility for prisoners awaiting transport to larger camps in the north. By mid-1944, it housed 600 German prisoners of war. Brenner and his group were processed through the intake building on the eastern perimeter. More photographs, more paperwork. They were assigned to barracks, issued bedding, given orientation briefings in broken German by a corporal who had learned the language from his grandfather. Barracks. 7. 16 men per hut. Corrugated iron roof. Wooden walls. Concrete floor. Small coal stove in the center. Each man received a metal cot with an actual mattress. A wooden footlocker. A shelf for personal items. Brenner had expected concrete bunkers, guard towers with machine guns, searchlights, beatings for minor infractions. Instead, he found something that looked like a construction camp. The barracks were hot during the day and would be cold at night, but they were dry. The latrines had running water and actual toilets, flush toilets, not trenches, not buckets. On his first night at Camp Alva, Brenner ate in the mess hall. Beef stew with carrots and potatoes, white bread with margarine, coffee, apple pie, actual apple pie with a flaky crust, and apples cooked with cinnamon and sugar. Brenner sat at a long wooden table with other new arrivals and tried to understand what kind of prison fed its inmates beef stew and apple pie. A corporal named Heinrich Fischer, another prisoner who had been at Camp Alva for 8 months, sat down across from him. Fischer was 32, Bavarian, captured in North Africa in 43. He had kind eyes and the patient manner of a man who had explained this situation many times to many new prisoners. Fischer spooned his stew and spoke quietly in German. The United States had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention. The convention required that prisoners of war receive adequate food, housing, and medical treatment. The United States was following those rules. Not perfectly, not generously, but consistently. With modifications for wartime scarcity, but always above minimum convention standards. The prisoners would work, agricultural labor mostly, helping American farms that had lost workers to military service. They would be paid token amounts in camp vouchers, 80 cents per day. The vouchers could be spent at the camp canteen on cigarettes, writing paper soap, small luxuries. They would receive adequate clothing and shelter. They would not be executed or tortured or starved. They would be treated according to international law. Fischer said all of this while eating his stew, and Brenner realized the corporal was telling the truth. This was not propaganda designed to break their spirits through false hope. This was policy, constrained by wartime necessity, but still policy. Brenner ate his apple pie slowly, savoring each bite. He had not tasted cinnamon in 2 years, had not tasted real butter in longer than that. The pie was warm, the crust was flaky, the apples were sweet. He tried to remember the last time he had eaten something this good, before the war, before the Wehrmacht, before everything. That night, lying on his cot in Barracks 7, Brenner listened to the other men breathe. 16 German soldiers in an American prison camp in Oklahoma, sleeping on actual mattresses under wool blankets, bellies full of beef stew and apple pie. He could not make sense of it, could not reconcile it with anything he had been told, could not understand why the Americans would waste resources feeding prisoners when they could simply let them starve within the technical requirements of the Geneva Convention. The work began on September 18th. Brenner and 40 other prisoners were loaded into trucks and driven 20 miles west to farmland that stretched across the Oklahoma prairie. Wheat fields, cotton fields, cornfields, all of it being harvested before autumn rains. The farmer's name was Whitmore, 63 years old, weathered face, calloused hands, 2 sons fighting in the Pacific. He explained the job through an interpreter. Each prisoner would help with the cotton harvest, picking, bundling, loading wagons. Work hours were 6 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon with a 1-hour break for lunch. The labor was hard but straightforward. Meet the daily quota and you could rest. Fail to meet quota and you worked until it was done. Whitmore made it clear that cooperation benefited everyone. The farm needed labor. The prisoners needed occupation. Neither side gained from hostility. Brenner started working at 6:15 that first morning. The labor was physical, bending, reaching, pulling cotton bolls from plants. The bolls had sharp edges that cut his fingers. The September sun was hot. The Oklahoma heat was different from European heat, drier, heavier. By 9 in the morning, Brenner's hands were blistered. By 11, his back ached from bending. By noon, he understood why Whitmore had emphasized that finishing early meant rest. The faster he worked, the sooner he could stop. Brenner finished his section by 3:45 in the afternoon. He stacked his last bundle on the wagon and walked to the oak tree near the farmhouse to report completion. Whitmore checked the work, counted the bundles, marked Brenner's name on a clipboard. Done. 15 minutes early. Brenner sat under the oak tree with 6 other prisoners who had also finished and waited for the truck to take them back to camp. The shade was cool. The grass was soft. He could hear cicadas singing in the heat, could smell the earth and the cotton and the oak leaves overhead. For 15 minutes, he was just a man sitting under a tree, not a soldier, not a prisoner, just a man resting after a day's work. That evening in the barracks, Fisher told Brenner about the Saturday arrangement. Weekends were rest days, no work. Prisoners could attend religious services if they wanted, Catholic Mass, Lutheran service, both conducted by American chaplains in broken German. Prisoners could play football on the field behind the barracks, read books from the camp library, write letters home, though the letters were censored and took months to arrive if they arrived at all. And sometimes, Fisher said, if behavior was good, and if guards were available, and if the camp administration approved, small groups could participate in supervised activities in town. Brenner asked what kind of activities. Fisher grinned. The kind that involved beer. Brenner thought Fisher was joking, lying, exaggerating to seem important to new prisoners. Prisoners did not visit towns. Prisoners stayed behind wire. That was how prison camps worked. But Fisher was not lying. On Saturday, October 7th at 6:45 in the evening, Sergeant Dalton Hayes walked through the camp compound announcing that 9 prisoners could volunteer for an evening visit to Cherokee. Supervised activity, 2-hour duration, returned by 9:30, good behavior required. English not necessary, but helpful. Brenner volunteered. He had not been outside the camp except for work details. The idea of seeing an American town seemed impossible. Prisoners did not visit towns, but Fisher had said it was real, and Brenner wanted to see if that was true, wanted to see what else might be true that he had been told was impossible. That was how Brenner ended up standing outside the Lucky Star Tavern at 7:23 in the evening on October 14th, 1944, watching Sergeant Hayes hold the door open while telling him to enter. The tavern sat on Cherokee's Main Street, 2-story brick building, slate roof, small windows with blackout curtains partially drawn even though the war was an ocean away. Brenner could hear voices inside, American voices, civilians, people whose country was at war with his country, people who had every reason to hate him. Hayes gestured again. "Come on, don't make me stand here all night." Brenner stepped through the door. The interior was warm. A coal fire burned in a stone fireplace on the far wall. The room held maybe 30 people, men and women, sitting at wooden tables, standing at the bar, talking, smoking, drinking. A Wurlitzer jukebox in the corner played country music, something about lost love and dusty roads. The conversation dimmed when Brenner and the other 8 Germans entered. Everyone looked. Brenner could see the recognition in their faces, the PW patches on the uniforms, German prisoners, enemy soldiers, men who wore the same uniform as the regime that had allied with Japan, the same Japan that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the same war that had taken their sons and husbands and brothers and sent them to fight on islands with names most Americans could not pronounce. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. Then an older man at the bar, white-haired, wearing a tweed jacket and wire-rimmed glasses, raised his pint glass in a small salute and nodded. Just that. A nod. An acknowledgement. Not friendly exactly. Not hostile. Just a recognition that people had entered, and people deserved to be acknowledged as people. The tension broke. Conversations resumed. The jukebox kept playing. Hayes led the prisoners to a corner table near the fireplace. The heat from the fire was immediate. Brenner could feel it on his face, could smell the coal smoke and the cigarette smoke and the beer and the perfume from women sitting at nearby tables. A woman approached, 42 years old. Dark hair pinned back, wearing a simple dress and an apron, face lined with the kind of tired that came from years of hard work. She carried a notepad and a pencil. Hayes spoke to her briefly. She nodded, looked at the 9 Germans without expression, neither welcoming nor cold, just looking. Hayes turned to the prisoners and spoke in broken German. Each prisoner could have 1 beer. The United States Army would pay. The prisoners could sit, could talk quietly among themselves, could drink. But they could not leave the tavern, could not approach other customers without permission, could not cause trouble, and this privilege ended forever. Did everyone understand? 9 Germans nodded. Hayes ordered for the group. 9 cores, bottles not draft. The woman, whose name Brenner would learn later was Edith Calloway, returned 5 minutes later with 9 beer bottles. Cold, condensation dripping down the glass. She set them on the table without comment, without eye contact, just set them down and walked away. Brenner picked up his bottle and stared at it. This was not supposed to happen. Wars did not include moments where enemies drank together in public houses. Wars were trenches and artillery and men screaming in languages you did not understand. Wars were burning tanks and dead friends and orders that made no sense. Wars were propaganda posters showing the enemy as monsters who ate children and raped women and burned cities for pleasure. Wars were not cold beer in glass bottles served by tired women in Oklahoma taverns while country music played on jukeboxes. But here it was, real, undeniable. Brenner took his first sip. The beer was cold. Actually cold. Not cellar cool. Cold. The carbonation was sharp on his tongue. The taste was different from German lager. More bitter, lighter. But it was real beer, in a real glass bottle, served to a German prisoner in an American bar. He drank slowly, watching the other customers. The civilians had returned to their normal Saturday evening, talking, laughing, dancing to the jukebox. A young couple swayed together near the fireplace. An older woman played cards at a corner table with 3 men who looked like farmers. The white-haired man at the bar was talking to Hayes now, asking something in English that Brenner could not quite follow. The absurdity was complete. Brenner sat in a corner of an American tavern drinking American beer, while American civilians sat 10 feet away doing the same thing. While war raged in Europe, while American soldiers died on Pacific islands, while German cities burned under Allied bombs, while his sister Greta, if she was still alive, probably stood in line for ration cards in Munich, wondering if her brother was dead or captured or still fighting. Hayes sat at an adjacent table with the 2 other guards, also drinking beer, also watching the prisoners, but not aggressively, not like guards watching criminals, more like chaperones watching teenagers, making sure no one did anything stupid, but otherwise letting the evening unfold. One of the guards, a corporal whose name Brenner did not know, walked over after 20 minutes. He spoke in broken German, asked if the beer was acceptable, if the temperature was all right, if anyone needed anything. Brenner said the beer was good. Thank you. The corporal smiled, said his grandfather had come from Cologne, had taught him a little German, not much, but enough to be useful here. The corporal returned to his table. Brenner returned to his beer. He finished the bottle by 8 o'clock, set the empty glass on the table and sat with his hands in his lap, watching the scene. Edith Calloway moved between tables, collecting empty glasses, taking orders, talking to customers. She treated the German prisoners exactly like the other customers. Polite, efficient, no special attention, no hostility, no warmth, just service. The white-haired man at the bar, the one who had nodded earlier, approached Hayes and spoke quietly. Brenner caught fragments, something about another round. Hayes shook his head. 1 beer per man was the rule. The old man accepted this, nodded, returned to his seat. But the gesture lingered. An American civilian offering to buy German prisoners a 2nd round of beer, during a war that had killed hundreds of thousands. What kind of country did that? What kind of people thought that way? At 8:45, Hayes stood and announced in German that it was time to return to camp. The prisoners finished their drinks, stood, walked to the door. Several customers called out as they left. Good night. Safe travels. Not friendly exactly, but not hostile. Just acknowledgement. The prisoners climbed into the back of the truck. Hayes and the other guards sat up front. The truck drove through Cherokee's quiet streets, past houses with lights in the windows, past a church with a white steeple, past shops closed for the evening, back to the highway, back to Camp Alva. Brenner sat in the truck bed and could not speak. He had nothing to say that would make sense of what had just happened. No words in German or the little English he knew that could explain why an American widow had served him beer, why an American veteran had nodded acknowledgement, why American guards had sat drinking at an adjacent table instead of standing watch with rifles. That night, back in Barrack 7, Brenner wrote a letter to his sister Greta in Munich. The letters were censored, so he could not write about camp locations or guard numbers or anything military. He could only write about general conditions and his health. He wrote that he was safe, that the Americans were treating him correctly, that he had enough food, that he slept in a real bed, that he had visited a tavern that evening and drunk a beer. He knew Greta would not believe that last part. She would think he was using code, or joking, or that the censors had missed something because surely no prison camp let prisoners visit taverns. But it had happened. He had been there. He had drunk the beer. He had sat in that corner near the fireplace and watched Americans live their normal lives while he, the enemy, sat among them. Brenner sealed the letter, put it in the box for outgoing mail, lay down on his cot and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow was Sunday, rest day. Maybe he would attend the Lutheran service. Maybe he would play football. Maybe he would just sit under a tree and try to understand what kind of country did these things. Try to understand what it meant that everything he had been told about America for the past 10 years was apparently a lie. Try to understand what other lies he had been told, what other truths he had refused to see. In the darkness of Barrack 7, surrounded by sleeping Germans, Wilhelm Brenner closed his eyes and thought about cold beer in a glass bottle and a woman named Edith who had served it without comment, and an old man who had raised his glass in acknowledgement. And for the first time since his surrender at Falaise, the shame in his chest eased just slightly. Not forgiveness. He did not deserve forgiveness. But maybe the possibility that the world was more complicated than the propaganda had claimed, that enemies could be human, that humanity could survive even in the worst circumstances if people chose to preserve it. Brenner fell asleep thinking about that choice. Over the next 10 weeks, through 5 more Saturday visits to the Lucky Star, he would think about it constantly. Every time Edith served beer without comment, every time Hayes sat with the guards instead of standing watch, every time Americans acknowledged Germans as men instead of monsters. He would still be thinking about it when the photographs from Bergen-Belsen arrived, when he returned to Munich and found his family dead and his city destroyed. When he opened his wallet 45 years later and saw the beer coaster that proved this moment had been real. But that was still weeks away. Tonight, October 14th, 1944, Wilhelm Brenner was just a 26-year-old German prisoner trying to sleep after drinking American beer in an American tavern. Tomorrow, he would wake and work in the cotton fields. Next Saturday, if his behavior remained good, he would return to the Lucky Star. And slowly, beer by beer, he would begin to understand that the world he thought he knew had been a lie. And that truth, however painful, was the only foundation on which anything good could be built. The cotton harvest ended on November 3rd, 1944. Wilhelm Brenner stood in Farmer Whitmore's field at 3 in the afternoon watching the last wagon roll toward the barn and realized he had picked cotton for 7 weeks without missing a single day. Without complaint, without resistance. He had become efficient at it, could finish his quota by 1 in the afternoon most days, could look at a row of cotton plants and calculate exactly how long it would take to strip them clean. He had become a good worker, a reliable worker, the kind of worker Whitmore nodded to when the daily counts were tallied. Brenner was not sure how he felt about that. The next day, the work changed. Whitmore gathered the prisoners after breakfast and explained through the interpreter that cotton season was over. The farm still needed help, but different help. Fence repair, equipment maintenance, preparing fields for winter wheat. Some prisoners would be reassigned to other farms. Some would go to forestry work in the Ouachita Mountains to the east. Brenner's group was assigned to timber cutting. On November 6th, they loaded into trucks at dawn and drove 3 hours east into Arkansas. The landscape changed. Flat Oklahoma prairie gave way to rolling hills, pine forests, oak forests, mountains that were not really mountains by European standards, but hills that thought they were mountains. The Ouachitas, ancient, worn down by time. The logging camp sat in a valley between two ridges. Temporary structures, sawmill, equipment sheds, sleeping quarters for the American supervisors. The German prisoners would be trucked in daily from Camp Alva, 3 hours each way, 6 hours of driving for 8 hours of work. The labor was different from cotton, heavier, more dangerous. Cutting timber with two-man saws, stripping branches, loading logs onto trucks. The work required coordination, trust. 2 men on opposite ends of a saw had to work together, or the blade would bind and jam. Brenner was partnered with a prisoner named Georg Wolf, 31 years old, from Hamburg, captured in Italy. Quiet man, good worker. They spent the first day learning each other's rhythm. Pull, push, pull, push. The saw blade moving through pine wood, the smell of fresh sawdust, the sound of trees cracking and falling. By the end of the first week, they could drop a tree in 12 minutes. By the end of the second week, 9 minutes. They became efficient, reliable, good workers. The Saturday pub visits continued. October 28th, November 11th, November 25th. Every 2 weeks, if behavior was good, 9 prisoners could volunteer for the Lucky Star. Brenner volunteered every time. So did Fisher, so did Wolf, so did 6 others who had been on that first visit. The pattern established itself. Truck to Cherokee at 7 in the evening, 2 hours at the tavern, 1 beer per man, return by 9:30, the same 9 Germans, the same 3 guards. Hayes always leading, the same corner table near the fireplace, and slowly, very slowly, the atmosphere changed. On the second visit, October 28th, Edith Calloway remembered Brenner's drink preference. She brought the beer without asking, Coors, bottle, cold, set it down with that same neutral expression. But she had remembered that small detail, that Brenner preferred Coors over Budweiser. It was a tiny thing, meaningless in the grand scheme of war and captivity and international conflict. But it meant something to Brenner. It meant he had been seen, recognized, remembered as an individual rather than as one of 9 identical enemy prisoners. On the third visit, November 11th, Armistice Day, the tavern was quieter than usual. Many of the regular customers were at the Veterans Memorial Service in the town square. The white-haired man at the bar, whose name Brenner learned was Edgar Patterson, was there, though, sitting in his usual spot, drinking his usual beer. Patterson was 71 years old, veteran of the First War, had fought in France in 1918, had seen the trenches, had survived the influenza, had come home to Oklahoma and built a life that included a hardware store and a wife who had died in 39 and 3 children who were scattered across the country now. Patterson asked Hayes in English that Brenner could barely follow if the German boys wanted a second round. On him. His treat. Hayes declined politely. 1 beer per man was the regulation. Army policy. Could not bend the rules even for good intentions. Patterson accepted this, nodded, returned to his beer. But the gesture stayed with Brenner. An American veteran of the First War, a man who had fought Germans in French trenches, offering to buy German prisoners a second round of beer during the Second War. What kind of man did that? What kind of thinking led to that choice, Brenner wanted to ask. Wanted to walk over to the bar and speak to Patterson in his broken English and ask why. Why acknowledge them? Why offer kindness? Why treat enemies like human beings who deserved beer? But Brenner did not have the English, did not have the courage, did not have the right to ask those questions. So he sat at his corner table and watched Patterson drink alone at the bar and wondered. November 25th was Thanksgiving weekend. Brenner did not understand Thanksgiving. Fisher tried to explain it. An American holiday, pilgrims and Indians and harvest celebration and gratitude, a day for families to gather and eat turkey and give thanks for blessings. It sounded strange, foreign, nothing like German holidays. But the Americans took it seriously. The camp mess hall served turkey that Thursday. Actual turkey with gravy and mashed potatoes and something called cranberry sauce that was sweet and tart and completely unlike anything Brenner had ever tasted. The Saturday after Thanksgiving, the Lucky Star was half empty. Families were still traveling, still visiting relatives, still working through leftovers. Only a dozen customers scattered across the tables. Hayes led the 9 Germans to their usual corner. Edith brought the beers. The jukebox played something slow and sad about a woman who left and never came back. And then Hayes did something unexpected. He stood up from the guards' table, carried his own beer, and walked over to sit with the Germans. This had never happened before. Guards sat with guards. Prisoners sat with prisoners. The separation was maintained. Not hostile, not aggressive, just maintained. It was how things worked. But Hayes sat down at the German table with his bottle of Budweiser and looked at Brenner directly. Hayes spoke in slow, careful English. Brenner understood maybe half the words. The other prisoners who had better English translated the rest. Hayes said, "My father was Otto Becker, German. Came to America in 1897, settled in Kansas, married my mother in 1900. When the First War started, he went back to Germany to fight. Felt it was his duty. Fought for Germany even though he had lived in America for 17 years. He was captured by American forces in France in 1918. Spent 14 months in a prisoner of war camp in Kentucky. The Americans treated him well, fed him, gave him work, paid him in camp vouchers, let him write letters home. When the war ended, he was repatriated to Germany. But Germany was destroyed, broken, starving. So he came back to America, back to Kansas, back to my mother, became a citizen, raised me and my brothers, worked as a mechanic, died in 36. Hayes paused, drank his beer, continued. My father told me stories about that camp in Kentucky. Said the Americans treated German prisoners better than the German army treated German soldiers. Said he ate better as a prisoner than he ever did in the trenches. Said the Americans showed him that enemies do not have to hate each other, that war is politics and economics and geography, but humanity is choice. Hayes looked at Brenner, looked at each of the 9 Germans. He said, I requested this assignment. Specifically, I asked to work with German prisoners because my father told me that someone in Kentucky chose to treat him with dignity, and I wanted to pay that forward, wanted to show you that America remembers, that kindness compounds, that what you do in war matters because war ends, but humanity continues. Hayes stood, picked up his beer, walked back to the guards' table. The 9 Germans sat in silence. Brenner felt something crack inside his chest. Not break. Crack. Like ice on a river in early spring. Still solid. Still holding. But beginning to give way. He had been taught that Americans were weak, soft, decadent, incapable of real sacrifice or real strength. That their prosperity made them cowardly. That they would collapse when confronted with true hardship. But Hayes had just described a system that treated enemies well, not because it was easy, but because it was right. A system that operated on principles rather than convenience. A system that saw long-term consequences rather than short-term satisfaction. That was not weakness. That was something else entirely. After Hayes returned to his table, Edith brought a second round of beers. Against regulations, against policy. But she set them on the table and said in English that Brenner mostly understood on the house. Happy Thanksgiving. Hayes saw, but said nothing, looked away, allowed it. Brenner drank his second beer slowly, trying to understand, trying to reconcile, trying to figure out what it meant that a German immigrant had been treated well in American captivity 30 years ago, and that treatment had created a ripple that extended to this moment, this table, this beer. What it meant that mercy was not weakness, but investment. That humanity was not naive sentiment, but practical strategy. That treating enemies well did not mean forgetting justice, but rather building the foundation for whatever came after the fighting stopped. The drive back to Camp Alva that night was silent. 9 Germans sitting in the truck bed, thinking, processing, carrying something new. Brenner lay on his cot that night and stared at the ceiling and thought about Otto Becker, a German immigrant who fought for Germany and was captured by America and treated well enough that 30 years later his son requested assignment to care for German prisoners. Compound interest, but for kindness instead of money. The forest work continued through November and into early December. Brenner and Wolf became a good team, efficient, safe. They could read each other now, could anticipate movements, could work in the rhythm that made the saw sing through wood like it was cutting butter. They did not talk much while working. The labor required too much breath. But during breaks, sitting on fallen logs eating the sandwiches the camp provided, they talked. Wolf had a wife in Hamburg, Marianne, 2 daughters, 8 and 6 years old when he left for the army in 42. Would be 10 and 8 now if they were still alive. He had not heard from them in 14 months. Did not know if the letters were not getting through or if there was no one left to send letters. Brenner told Wolf about Greta, his sister, 4 years younger, living in Munich with their parents, or had been living there. Brenner had sent 6 letters since being captured, had received 1 reply in October. Greta was alive as of August, working in a factory making parachutes. Their parents were alive. Their younger brother Klaus was serving on the Eastern Front. No details, just alive. That was all he knew. The 2 men sat on logs in Arkansas forest and talked about people they might never see again, about cities that might not exist anymore, about futures that might be ashes. And then they picked up their saw and went back to cutting trees, because what else could they do? December brought cold weather. Oklahoma winter. Not as brutal as German winters, but cold enough. The barracks had coal stoves, but coal was rationed. Each barracks received enough coal for 4 hours of heat per evening. The rest of the time the men relied on blankets and body heat and layers of clothing. Brenner had weighed himself on November 4th. The camp had a scale in the medical building, 160 pounds. Up 12 pounds from his arrival weight of 148, 12 pounds in 8 weeks. His face had filled out. His energy had returned. His hands, calloused from work but no longer bleeding, were strong. He was healthier as a prisoner than he had been as a soldier. That realization sat uncomfortably in his mind. He had served in the Wehrmacht for 3 years, had fought in France, had survived Normandy, had eaten Wehrmacht rations and slept in Wehrmacht tents and followed Wehrmacht orders, and he had slowly starved, slowly weakened, slowly watched his body consume itself. 2 months in American captivity had reversed 3 years of German military service. What did that say about Germany? About the Wehrmacht? About the system he had served? What did it say that the enemy fed their prisoners better than the fatherland fed its soldiers? On December 9th, the 6th pub visit, something changed. The evening started like the others. 9 prisoners, 3 guards, the truck ride to Cherokee, the walk to the Lucky Star, the corner table near the fireplace, Edith bringing beers without being asked. But 30 minutes in a new customer entered. Young man, maybe 23, 24 years old, army uniform, infantry insignia, fresh back from the Pacific, judging by the tropical tan still visible on his forearms. He walked to the bar, ordered a whiskey, turned around while waiting for his drink, and saw the Germans. His face changed, hardened. The color drained from his cheeks and then flooded back red and hot. He saw the PW patches, saw the dark brown uniforms, saw 9 enemy soldiers sitting in an American bar drinking American beer while his friends rotted in Pacific graves. He stood, took 3 steps toward their table. Hayes moved to intercept, but the soldier was faster, angrier. He stopped 5 feet from Brenner, close enough that Brenner could see the Purple Heart ribbon on his chest, the combat infantryman badge, the scars on his knuckles that looked like they came from something other than combat. The soldier spoke, fast, loud, English that Brenner could not follow, but the tone needed no translation. Rage, pure and justified. Hayes put a hand on the soldier's shoulder, spoke quietly, trying to de-escalate, trying to explain. The soldier shook his head, pointed at Brenner, said something that included the word SS. Brenner caught that much. Hayes spoke again, firmer this time, not a request, an order. The soldier looked at Hayes, looked at Brenner, looked at the beer bottles on the table. His jaw worked, his fists clenched and unclenched. The whole tavern had gone silent, watching, waiting to see what would happen when American rage met American discipline. Finally, the soldier nodded. Once, sharp, turned, walked back to the bar, picked up his whiskey, drank it in one swallow, slammed the glass down, walked out. The door closed behind him. The silence held for another 10 seconds. Then Edith started moving again, collecting glasses. The jukebox resumed playing. Conversations started up quieter than before, but still there. Hayes returned to the German table, sat down, said in German, "That man lost his brother on Peleliu. 16 years old. Lied about his age to enlist, died on the 2nd day of fighting." Hayes paused. Continued. "He wanted to hurt you. Had every right to want that. But he chose not to. Chose to leave. That is what discipline looks like. That is what separates us from barbarism." He stood, walked back to the guards' table. The evening continued, but something had shifted. Brenner sat very still with his beer getting warm in his hand and understood something new. Mercy was not universal. Mercy was not automatic. Mercy was individual choice made moment by people who had every reason to choose otherwise. Hayes chose it. Edith chose it. Patterson chose it. Even that young soldier drowning in justified rage had chosen to walk away rather than give in to what he felt. That made the mercy more valuable, not less. Made it real instead of theoretical. Made it something earned and given freely rather than something owed or compulsory. Brenner finished his beer and thought about the soldier's brother. 16 years old, dead on a beach 10,000 miles from home. Dead, fighting an ally of the regime Brenner had served. He had no words for that, no justification, no defense, only the weight of it, the knowledge that he wore a uniform that represented the alliance that had killed that boy, that his choices, his service, his willingness to believe convenient lies had contributed to a war that killed 16-year-olds who lied about their age to fight. The truck ride back to camp that night was quieter than usual. The other prisoners had felt it too. The reminder that mercy was not weakness, that forgiveness was not forgetting, that being treated well did not mean being absolved. The Saturday before Christmas, December 23rd, the camp approved a special visit to the Lucky Star. 15 prisoners instead of the usual 9. Extended time, 3 hours instead of 2. The guards said it was a Christmas gesture. Goodwill, peace on earth. Brenner volunteered. So did Fisher and Wolfe and 11 others. The Lucky Star was decorated. Paper snowflakes hanging from the ceiling. A small evergreen tree in the corner with handmade ornaments. Tinsel. Candles. The smell of pine and cinnamon and coal smoke from the fireplace. The tavern was busier than usual. Families celebrating. Children running between tables. Women wearing their best dresses. Men in clean shirts and ties. The jukebox played Christmas carols. Silent night. "O come all ye faithful." songs that existed in both English and German, songs that transcended borders. The 15 Germans sat at 2 tables pushed together near the fireplace. Edith brought beers and something else. Hot cider, apple cider heated with cinnamon sticks and cloves. She set the mugs on the table and said, "Merry Christmas, boys. Boys, not prisoners, not enemies. Boys." Brenner wrapped his hands around the warm mug and smelled the cider and felt the heat seep into his fingers. He sipped. The cider was sweet and spiced and warm, tasted like childhood, like Christmas markets in Munich before the war, like normalcy. Around 8 o'clock, Edgar Patterson stood up from his usual spot at the bar. He pulled a harmonica from his pocket, small silver instrument, worn from years of use. He played a few notes, testing, tuning. Then he played Silent Night. The tavern quieted. Conversations stopped. People turned to listen. Patterson played slowly, simply, each note clear and pure, the melody that everyone knew, the song that existed in every language, the song that German and American soldiers had sung in trenches 30 years ago during the Christmas truce of 1914. When Patterson reached the chorus, someone started singing. A woman's voice, English lyrics, "Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright." And then quietly, almost unconsciously, the Germans began to hum. The same melody, the same intervals, but different words in their minds. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, alles schläft einsam wacht, German and English, enemy and enemy. Singing the same song in different languages in an Oklahoma tavern while war raged across 2 oceans. Brenner looked around the room, saw Americans with tears on their cheeks, saw a woman at a corner table, Mrs. Henderson, who had 2 sons fighting in Europe, crying openly while singing, saw Hayes sitting very still with his eyes closed, saw Edith Calloway standing behind the bar with her hand pressed against her mouth, not crying, not smiling, just standing there, holding something inside. When the song ended, the silence held for a long moment. Then Patterson lowered his harmonica, nodded to the Germans, returned to his seat. The jukebox started playing again. Conversations resumed. But something had shifted. Some invisible wall had developed another crack. Before they left that night, Hayes gave Brenner a small package, wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. Hayes said, "Merry Christmas. Do not open it here. Wait until you are back at camp." Brenner took the package. It was light, book-sized. He nodded his thanks. In the truck on the way back to Camp Alva, Brenner held the package in his lap, wondering. The other prisoners asked what it was. He said he did not know, would not know until he opened it. Back in Barracks 7, alone in the corner near his cot, Brenner unwrapped the package. Inside were 2 items, a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, 20 cigarettes, American tobacco, valuable currency in the camp economy, and an English-German dictionary, small, pocket-sized, published in New York in 1938. Used, the corners were worn, some pages were dog-eared, but complete, functional. Brenner opened the front cover, found an inscription in pencil. Handwriting he did not recognize. To Dalton, from Dad. Learn it well. Language is the first step toward understanding. O.B., 1922. O.B. Otto Becker, Hayes's father, the German immigrant who had been a prisoner in Kentucky. Hayes had given Brenner his father's dictionary, the dictionary Otto Becker had used to teach his son German. The dictionary that represented the bridge between 2 countries, 2 languages, 2 ways of being human. Brenner sat on his cot holding the dictionary, hands shaking, throat tight. He had nothing to give in return, no gift, no gesture, nothing except the crisp military salute he had been trained to deliver, the salute that meant respect, honor, acknowledgement of rank and authority, But Hayes was not there to receive it, would not be there, had given the gift and walked away without expecting reciprocation. That was the point. The gift was not transaction, it was investment. Otto Becker had been treated well in Kentucky. Dalton Hayes was treating Germans well in Oklahoma. And maybe someday, somewhere, one of these Germans would treat someone else well, would choose mercy over revenge, would build instead of destroy, compound interest, extended across generations. Brenner opened the dictionary to a random page, found the entry for Dankbarkeit, gratitude. The English translation was listed below. Thankfulness, appreciation, recognition of benefit received. He did not have the English to express what he felt. Did not have the German either, really. The words were too small for the thing pressing against his chest. But he had the dictionary now. Could learn. Could build vocabulary. Could find the language to describe this strange captivity where enemies drank beer together and sang Christmas carols and gave each other dictionaries that represented everything propaganda said was impossible. That night, December 23, 1944, Wilhelm Brenner lay on his cot in Barracks 7 and read his first page of English-German translation by the light of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The word he looked up was mercy, Barmherzigkeit in German. But the English definition said more. Compassion or forgiveness shown towards someone whom it is within one's power to punish or harm. Within one's power to punish or harm. The Americans had the power. Germany was losing the war. Everyone knew it by now. The Allies had liberated France, were approaching Germany's borders. The Red Army was advancing from the east. It was only a matter of time. The Americans had the power to punish, to harm, to take revenge for Pearl Harbor and the Atlantic War and the alliance with Japan. They had the power and the justification and the moral authority. But they chose something else. They chose to treat prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards, to pay them for work, to feed them adequately, to let them visit taverns and drink beer and sing Christmas carols. They chose mercy, not because they were weak, not because they did not care about justice, but because they understood something that German propaganda had never taught Brenner. That mercy was stronger than revenge, that humanity preserved was more valuable than humanity destroyed, that what you build matters more than what you burn. Brenner closed the dictionary, placed it carefully in his footlocker under his spare socks. The Lucky Strikes went in there too. He would not smoke them, would not trade them, would save them. Evidence that this moment was real. Evidence that on December the 23rd, 1944, an American sergeant gave a German prisoner his father's dictionary and asked for nothing in return except the possibility that kindness might compound. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. The camp would have a special meal, turkey again, maybe pie. The chaplain would conduct services in the recreation hall, Catholic Mass at 6, Lutheran service at 8. Brenner would attend the Lutheran service, would sit with the other Germans, would sing the hymns he knew from childhood, would pray to a God he was no longer sure was listening, would try to understand how the world had become this strange place where enemies were human and mercy was policy, and Christmas could be celebrated in a prison camp in Oklahoma while cities burned in Europe. But those questions were too big for tonight, too complicated, too heavy. Tonight, Wilhelm Brenner was just a prisoner who had received a dictionary for Christmas and who would spend the next 3 months learning English words and waiting for the war to end and hoping that when it did, there would be something left to return to, something left to build, something left that mercy could preserve. The winter passed slowly. January brought freezing rain that turned the camp into mud. February brought snow that fell wet and heavy and melted by afternoon. The forest work continued when weather allowed. When it did not, the prisoners stayed in camp and worked maintenance, repairing roofs, fixing fences, clearing drainage ditches. Wilhelm Brenner spent his evenings with the dictionary. He started with simple words, nouns, verbs, basic grammar. The dictionary had example sentences that showed how words connected, how English built meaning differently than German, how the same idea could be expressed in multiple ways depending on context and emphasis. By mid-January, Brenner could read simple sentences. By February, he could follow basic conversations when Hayes spoke slowly. By March, he could respond, halting, awkward, but functional. Hayes noticed, started speaking more English to Brenner, correcting pronunciation, explaining idioms, teaching the informal language that did not appear in dictionaries, the slang, the regional expressions.
The way Oklahoma English differed from New York English or Texas English, language became a bridge, a way to communicate across the divide of uniform and nationality and war. On March 15th, Fisher was called to the administration building. He returned 2 hours later with paperwork. Release authorization. Fisher had been classified as low risk, no SS affiliation, no war crimes suspected. Model prisoner behavior for 18 months. He was being transferred to a work program in Colorado. Farm labor for a civilian employer. Less supervision, more freedom. A step toward eventual repatriation when the war ended. Fisher packed his belongings that evening. A small canvas bag, spare clothes, toiletries, letters from home, the few items he had accumulated over 18 months. Before he left, he found Brenner at the corner of the barracks near the coal stove. Fisher said in German, "What will you tell people about this place when you go home?" Brenner thought about the question.
Said that I was treated better as an enemy prisoner than as a German soldier, that the Americans fed us and paid us and let us drink beer in public taverns, that everything we were told about American weakness was a lie. Fisher nodded. Said, "Will they believe you?" Brenner said no, but it will be true anyway. Fisher extended his hand. They shook. Fisher left the next morning. Brenner never saw him again. But the question stayed. What will you tell people? The truth. But the truth was complicated now. The truth included things Brenner had not wanted to see, patterns he had not wanted to recognize, evidence that did not fit the narrative he had been taught to believe. By March 1945, even the most dedicated believers in German victory knew the war was lost. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin. German armies were collapsing on all fronts. It was only a matter of time. The prisoners heard the news through camp radio broadcasts, through newspapers the guards shared, through letters from home that arrived months late and described cities that no longer existed, and families that had been scattered or killed or simply vanished. Brenner received a letter from Greta on March 20th, posted in January. 3 months to cross the Atlantic. The paper was thin, the handwriting shaky. She wrote that their parents were still alive, that Klaus was still on the Eastern Front, last letter received in November, that Munich was being bombed regularly, that food was scarce, that she was working 12-hour shifts at the parachute factory and sleeping in the factory basement when the air raid sirens sounded. She asked if Wilhelm was being treated well, if he had enough to eat, if the Americans were cruel. Brenner sat in the barracks reading that letter and did not know how to respond. He could not write the truth, could not tell Greta that he weighed 160 pounds and ate 3 meals a day and had visited a tavern 6 times to drink beer, could not tell her that he was healthier and safer than she was, that he slept in a real bed while she slept in a factory basement, that he had gained 12 pounds while she probably lost 20. The guilt was physical, a weight in his chest that made breathing difficult. He was the enemy prisoner. She was the loyal citizen. He should be suffering while she prospered. But the reality was inverted, reversed, wrong. What did that say about the system they had both served? On May 8, 1945, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the camp radio broadcast the announcement. Germany had surrendered, unconditionally. The war in Europe was over.
600 German prisoners gathered in the main compound yard, standing in formation, silent. The announcement repeated. Germany has surrendered. The Third Reich has fallen. The war is over. Or some men cried, some stood stone-faced, some looked relieved, some looked devastated. Brenner felt nothing. Numbness. The news was not surprising. Everyone had known it was coming. But knowing and hearing were different things. The war was over. Germany had lost. Everything they had fought for, everything they had suffered for, everything they had believed was worth dying for, had ended in complete defeat. What had it all been for? The camp commandant, Major William Patterson Edgar's son, addressed the prisoners through an interpreter. He said the war was over, but the prisoners would remain in custody until repatriation could be arranged. The process would take months, maybe a year. There were millions of displaced persons across Europe. Transportation was limited. Priorities had to be established. Be patient, follow regulations, continue working. Eventually, everyone would go home, if there was still a home to return to. That night, Barracks 7 was silent. No conversations, no card games, no reading, just men lying on cots, staring at ceilings, thinking about what came next. 2 days later, on May 10th, Major Patterson called another assembly. The prisoners gathered again in the compound yard. 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Hot Oklahoma sun. 600 Germans standing in formation, wondering what new announcement would reshape their understanding of the world. Patterson stood on a raised platform. Behind him were 3 large boards covered with white sheets. He spoke through the interpreter. Said that news had reached the United States about German concentration camps, about places called Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald and Dachau, about atrocities that defied comprehension. He said that American and British forces had liberated these camps, had documented what they found, had taken photographs, had recorded testimony, had gathered evidence. He said that the evidence would now be shown to the prisoners, not as punishment, but as truth, as reality, as the thing that had been done in their name while they fought in France or Italy or Russia or North Africa. Patterson pulled the sheets off the boards. Photographs, dozens of them, enlarged, detailed, impossible to misinterpret. Skeletal prisoners standing behind wire, bodies stacked like firewood, mass graves, gas chambers, crematoria, children with hollow eyes, medical experiments, systematic murder on an industrial scale. The silence in the compound was absolute. 600 men staring at photographs that destroyed every justification they had carried for years. Brenner looked at the images and felt his mind refuse to process them. This could not be real, had to be propaganda. Allied lies designed to justify whatever punishment was coming. Germany would not do this, could not do this. The Wehrmacht was a professional military force. They fought armies, not civilians, but the photographs did not lie. The evidence did not lie. The locations were named, the dates were documented, the survivors were identified. British soldiers stood in the photographs next to the bodies. American medics tended to the barely living prisoners. The images were verified by multiple sources from multiple countries. This was real. All of it was real. Patterson spoke again, said that the British Parliament had demanded German prisoners of war receive reduced rations as punishment, that American newspapers were calling for the same, that the American public was horrified and angry and wanted justice. He said that he personally disagreed with collective punishment, that the Geneva Convention prohibited it, but that orders from Washington were clear. Rations would be reduced, not below minimum convention standards, but reduced, effective immediately. He said that all recreational privileges were suspended indefinitely. No more town visits, no more pub evenings, no more special activities. The prisoners would continue working, would continue receiving adequate shelter and medical care. But the comfortable relationship that had developed over the past 8 months was over. The assembly dismissed. The prisoners returned to barracks in silence. Brenner sat on his cot,
and stared at his hands. These hands had loaded shells into a tank gun, had fired at Allied positions, had served the Wehrmacht, had worn the uniform of a regime that built factories of death. He had not known. None of them had known. But ignorance was not innocence. Ignorance was complicity. Ignorance was choosing not to see, choosing not to ask questions, choosing to believe convenient lies rather than inconvenient truths. Brenner remembered the whispers he had heard during his time in France. Rumors about camps in the east, about trains full of people disappearing, about things soldiers were ordered not to discuss. He had dismissed those whispers as enemy propaganda, as Allied lies, as impossible exaggerations. He had chosen not to believe, and that choice made him complicit. The rations changed on May 15th. The mess hall still served 3 meals a day, but portions were smaller. No more butter, no more pie. Coffee was replaced with ersatz grain drink that tasted like burnt dirt. Meat servings were reduced. Vegetables were limited, still adequate by Geneva Convention standards. Still more than many German civilians were eating, but noticeably reduced from the comfortable abundance of the previous months. The camp atmosphere changed too. Guards became more formal, less conversational. They still maintained professional courtesy, still followed regulations. But the casual interactions stopped. The English lessons stopped. The small kindnesses disappeared. The prisoners understood. The guards were human. They had seen the same photographs, had read the same news reports, had learned what Germany had done. And they were disgusted, horrified, angry. But they maintained discipline, maintained professionalism, maintained the standards that separated America from the regime that built Dachau. They did not beat prisoners, did not withhold medical care, did not violate the Geneva Convention. They reduced rations and suspended privileges and increased formality, but they maintained humanity even in their disgust. That restraint was more devastating than any punishment could have been. Brenner spent the week after the photographs in a fog, could not eat, could not sleep, could not think about anything except those images, the bodies, the children, the systematic efficiency of industrial murder. He worked in the forest, cutting trees with wolf. The physical labor was automatic now, did not require thought. His body moved through the motions while his mind tried to process the impossible. On May 22nd, a Tuesday evening, Hayes came to Barracks 7. He found Brenner sitting alone near the coal stove. The other prisoners had gone to the mess hall for dinner. Brenner had not eaten in 2 days. Hayes sat down on the bench across from Brenner, did not speak immediately, just sat. After a long silence, Hayes said in English, "You look like hell, Brenner." Brenner understood enough to nod. Hayes said, "You need to eat. Starving yourself does not change what happened, does not fix anything." Brenner said in halting English, "How can I eat? How can I? Anything." Hayes was quiet for a moment, then said, "By choosing to live, by choosing to do something useful with the life you still have, by understanding that you personally did not build those camps, did not run those gas chambers, did not murder those children." Brenner said, "I wore the uniform. I served the regime. I believed the lies." Hayes said, "Yes, you did, and now you know better. So, what are you going to do with that knowledge?" Brenner had no answer. Hayes pulled something from his pocket. The English-German dictionary. The one Hayes had given Brenner for Christmas. Brenner had tried to return it after the photographs, had brought it to Hayes and said he did not deserve it. Hayes had refused to take it back. Now Hayes set the dictionary on the bench between them. Said, "My father told me something when I was a boy. He said that Germany lost the First War because they forgot that soldiers are human beings first and Germans second, that when you strip away humanity in service of nationalism, you lose both.
He said the Americans showed him in that camp in Kentucky that humanity does not have to be sacrificed for duty, that you can maintain both, that maintaining both is what separates civilization from barbarism. Hayes looked at Brenner directly, said, "You want to make this right? You cannot. Those people are dead. Those children are dead. Nothing you do will bring them back or undo what was done. But you can choose how you live the rest of your life. You can choose to build instead of destroy. You can choose to preserve humanity instead of sacrifice it. You can choose to remember what you learned here and teach it to whoever comes after you." Hayes stood, left the dictionary on the bench, walked to the door, paused. He said, "Hating yourself changes nothing, Brenner. Living well changes everything. That is the only revenge worth taking against the people who built those camps. To prove they were wrong, to build something good, to preserve humanity they tried to destroy." Hayes left. Brenner sat alone with the dictionary. He picked it up, opened it, found the page where Hayes had written something in pencil that morning. English words, simple, clear. "The best revenge is to live well and prove them wrong." Brenner read those words 5 times, 10 times, until they started to mean something. He stood up, walked to the mess hall, ate dinner, thin soup and dark bread and ersatz coffee. But he ate. The next day he returned to work in the forest. The day after that the same. Every day through June and July and August, cutting trees, loading logs, working, living. The rations improved in August. The initial public anger had subsided. The camp administration restored fuller meals. Not quite the abundance of before, but adequate, comfortable. But the pub visits never resumed. That chapter was closed. The Lucky Star was part of a time before the photographs, before the truth, before everything changed. Brenner thought about that tavern often, about Edith Calloway serving beer without comment, about Edgar Patterson raising his glass in acknowledgement, about Hayes sitting at the German table on Thanksgiving, about the Christmas when they sang Silent Night together. Those moments felt like they belonged to different men, different Germans, different Americans, men who existed before the truth was undeniable. But the memories were real. The dictionary was real. The kindness had been real even if everything else was revealed as lies. That was important somehow. That mercy was still mercy, even when the people receiving it served evil. That humanity could be preserved even in the worst circumstances. That choosing to treat enemies well was not naive idealism, but practical wisdom. The summer passed. Fall arrived. The war in the Pacific ended in August after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world learned about a new kind of weapon, a new kind of horror, a new way to end cities in single moments. The war was over, completely, finally, irrevocably. Now came the reckoning. Repatriation began in October, slowly, in small groups, lowest risk prisoners first, no SS affiliation, no suspected war crimes, model behavior, clean records. Brenner was not in the first groups, not in the second or third either. His unit, the 12th SS Panzer Division, required additional screening. SS units were being investigated thoroughly. Every member questioned, every action documented. Brenner was interviewed 3 times by American intelligence officers, asked about his service, about what he saw, about what he did, about what he knew. He told the truth. He had been a tank gunner, had fought in Normandy, had surrendered in Falaise, had never been to Poland or Germany during the war, had no knowledge of camps beyond what everyone else claimed not to know. The officers wrote everything down, checked his statements against records, against testimony from other prisoners, against evidence from captured documents. In December, Brenner was cleared. No war crimes, no atrocities, just a soldier who had fought and lost and surrendered. He was scheduled for repatriation in January 1946. On January 12th, the orders came through.
Brenner and 199 other prisoners would depart January 20th, buses to New York, ship to Bremerhaven, then home, wherever home was now.
Whatever home meant. 6 days before departure on January 18th, Hayes came to Barracks 7 in the evening. He found Brenner packing his belongings: the canvas bag, the spare clothes, the letters from Greta, the dictionary, the pack of Lucky Strikes that Brenner had never smoked. Hayes said, "Get your cleanest uniform on. You are coming with me." Brenner asked where. Hayes said, "You will see. Move." Brenner changed into his least worn fatigues, followed Hayes to a jeep parked outside the barracks. They drove alone. No other prisoners, no other guards, just Hayes and Brenner. The drive took 20 minutes. Hayes did not speak, did not explain, just drove through the cold January night toward Cherokee. They stopped outside the Lucky Star Tavern. The building was dark, closed. A sign in the window said, "Private event tonight." Hayes got out of the jeep, gestured for Brenner to follow. They walked to the door. Hayes knocked 3 times, waited. The door opened. Edith Calloway stood there, 52 years old now, hair greyer than Brenner remembered, face more lined, but the same tired eyes, the same neutral expression. She stepped aside, let them enter. Inside the tavern was empty except for 3 people: Edgar Patterson at the bar, his son Major Patterson at a table near the fireplace, and Edith behind the counter. On one of the tables near the fireplace, a single place setting: a glass, a coaster, a bottle of Coors. Hayes said in English that Brenner now understood completely. Mrs. Calloway wanted to say goodbye properly. "You leave in 2 days. This is her way of marking the end." Edith spoke. Her voice was rough, like she did not use it much. She said in slow, careful English, "Mr. Brenner, when you first walked into my tavern in October of '44, I hated you. Hated your uniform, hated your accent, hated everything you represented. My husband Robert died at Pearl Harbor, killed when Japanese planes attacked the naval base. Your country's ally killed him, took him from me, left me alone to run this place and raise our daughter and figure out how to live with a hole in my life. I wanted to refuse to serve you, wanted to tell Sergeant Hayes to take you somewhere else, wanted you to feel the hatred I felt. But Sergeant Hayes reminded me why Robert fought. He fought so people could choose how to live, so people could make their own decisions instead of following orders from dictators, so freedom could survive even when it was hard. And I chose to serve you beer, not because I forgave you, not because I forgot Robert, but because that is what free people do. We choose mercy even when revenge would be easier. You are going home to Germany, to hell. Your cities are destroyed, your people are starving, your country is broken, but you are going home alive. And that means you can rebuild, can make something better, can prove that the regime you served was wrong. This is for you." Edith reached under the counter, pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. She set it on the bar, gestured for Brenner to open it. Brenner unwrapped the package carefully. Inside were 3 items: a beer coaster from the Lucky Star Tavern, cardboard, round. The tavern's name printed in black letters. A napkin. The napkin from November 25th, when Hayes had sat at the German table and talked about his father. Hayes had written English phrases on that napkin to help Brenner practice. "Thank you. Please. I am sorry." Brenner had kept the napkin, had shown it to Edith one evening trying to explain something he did not have the English for. Edith must have taken it to save it. And a newspaper clipping from the Cherokee Sentinel, November 1944, an article about Camp Alva prisoners helping local farms with the harvest, about how German POWs were contributing to the community, about how cooperation was possible even in war. Edith said, "Remember that enemies can become neighbors. It takes time, it takes choice, but it is possible. Remember that what you build matters more than what you destroy. Remember that humanity survives if we choose to preserve it." Edgar Patterson stood from his seat at the bar, pulled his harmonica from his pocket, played Silent Night one more time, slowly, simply, the melody that transcended borders and languages and wars. When the song ended, Patterson lowered the harmonica, walked over to Brenner, extended his hand. They shook. Patterson said, "Good luck, son. Build something good." Major Patterson stood, shook Brenner's hand, said, "The war is over. Go home. Rebuild. Prove that this was worth it." Hayes drove Brenner back to Camp Alva in silence. When they reached Barracks 7, Brenner tried to speak, tried to find words in English or German that could express what he felt. Hayes said, "I know. My father gave me the dictionary because someone in Kentucky chose mercy. Now you have the coaster because we chose mercy. Maybe someday you will choose mercy for someone else. That is how it works. That is how we survive." Brenner took the package into the barracks, opened his footlocker, put the coaster and the napkin and the clipping next to the dictionary and the lucky strikes. Evidence. Proof. Physical objects that verified these moments were real. On January 20th, 1946, 200 German prisoners boarded buses at Camp Alva. Brenner sat near the back, watching Oklahoma pass through the window. Flat prairie, cold winter sky, towns with names he could now read. A country he had learned to understand just slightly, just enough to know how much he had not understood before. The buses drove to Oklahoma City, then trains, 4 days across America, Oklahoma to Kansas to Chicago to New York, watching America pass, watching prosperity, watching normalcy. Watching a country that had won the war and barely noticed because the war had never truly reached American soil. The ship departed Brooklyn on January 24th, USS General M.C. Meigs, transport ship, 8 days crossing the Atlantic in winter, rough seas, cold wind, 200 Germans below deck thinking about what waited on the other side. Brenner spent hours on deck when weather allowed, standing at the rail, holding the beer coaster in his wallet, running his thumb across the cardboard, memorizing the texture, the shape, the words printed in fading black ink. Lucky Star Tavern, Cherokee, Oklahoma. Evidence that mercy was real, that humanity could survive even in the worst circumstances, that enemies could drink beer together and sing Christmas carols and treat each other as men instead of monsters. Evidence that he needed to remember, needed to carry forward, needed to build upon. The ship docked at Bremerhaven on February 1st, 1946, Germany in winter. Cold, grey, destroyed. The port was ruins. The city was ruins. Everything was ruins. British authorities processed the returning prisoners through a transit centre. More paperwork, more questions, denazification interviews, health screening, rail passes to final destinations. Brenner got his papers on February 4th, a ticket to Munich, 3rd class, 1 bag allowed. The train departed that evening, 18 hours, unheated cars, broken windows, no food service, stations that were rubble, bridges that had been hastily repaired, countryside that showed the scars of years of war. The train arrived at München Hauptbahnhof on February 5th at 9 in the morning. Brenner stepped onto the platform and did not recognize his city. Munich was gone. 70% destroyed. Entire districts reduced to rubble. Streets that were canyons between ruined buildings. People who looked like walking skeletons. Children begging. Old women pulling carts loaded with belongings salvaged from destroyed homes. Brenner walked through streets he had known since childhood and could not find landmarks, could not orient himself. The city was corpse. Germany was corpse. He found Greta after 3 hours of searching. She was living in 2 rooms of a partially destroyed apartment building in what remained of their old neighborhood in Schwabing. The building had no roof on one side, no windows, but the walls stood and the rooms were habitable if you did not mind cold and darkness and constant smell of ash. Greta opened the door and stared at him like he was a ghost. She was 22 years old, looked 40, thin, hollow-eyed, wearing clothes that hung on her skeletal frame. They embraced. Neither spoke. What was there to say? After a long silence, Greta told him the news. Their father had died in an air raid in October 1943. Their mother had died of pneumonia and starvation in January 1945. Their brother Klaus had been killed in Hungary in December 1944. Greta was all that remained. Greta and Wilhelm, two survivors of a family that had been 6. Brenner moved into the 2 rooms, found work clearing rubble. 12-hour days, 14-hour days. Paid in cigarettes because currency was meaningless. Real money was American cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, anything the occupying forces had that Germans did not. Brenner used the skills he had learned in Oklahoma: construction, forestry, manual labor. He worked 7 days a week rebuilding München Hauptbahnhof, clearing bomb damage, salvaging bricks. The city would take decades to restore, maybe generations, but it had to be rebuilt. What was the alternative? Greta found the beer coaster in March. She was washing Brenner's spare clothes, checking pockets before the laundry. Found his wallet, found the coaster inside. She asked what it was. Brenner told her. About Camp Alva, about the Lucky Star Tavern, about drinking beer with Americans while the war raged, about Edith and Hayes and Patterson and the Saturday evenings that seemed impossible even while they were happening. Greta did not believe him, said it had to be exaggeration, propaganda, fever dream. Prisoners did not drink beer in enemy taverns, did not get treated well, did not gain weight and learn English and receive gifts. Brenner showed her the dictionary, the newspaper clipping, the napkin with Hayes's handwriting. He said, "It happened. I was there. The Americans treated us better than Germany treated its own soldiers, fed us better, housed us better, showed us mercy when they had every right to show us revenge." Greta asked, "Then why are we starving while they have everything?" Brenner had no answer except, "Because we lost, and we deserved to lose." The coaster stayed in Brenner's wallet, through the years, through the decades, through rebuilding Germany, through currency reform in 48 when the Deutschmark replaced worthless Reichsmarks, through the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe with American money, through finding work that paid real wages, through meeting Anna in 49, through marriage in 51, through raising her children from her first husband who had died in Russia, through daughters of his own born in 52 and 53. The coaster went through all of it, a piece of cardboard from an Oklahoma tavern, fading, worn, but preserved. Brenner never returned to America, never contacted Hayes or Edith or Patterson, never tried to revisit that strange year when he was a prisoner who drank beer and learned English and discovered that enemies could be human. But he kept the coaster, kept the dictionary, kept the lessons. When tempted toward bitterness about Germany's defeat, he remembered that defeat had been earned, that Germany had built factories of death, that losing the war was not tragedy, but justice. When tempted toward hatred of America or Britain or the Allies, he remembered cold beer and Christmas carols and a widow who chose mercy over revenge. When tempted toward cynicism about humanity, he remembered that Hayes had given him his father's dictionary and asked for nothing in return except the possibility that kindness might compound across generations. Brenner built a small construction company in 1955, employed 30 workers by 1960, helped rebuild Munich schools and hospitals and apartment buildings, built things that would last, built things that served human needs rather than destroying them. He married Anna and raised 4 daughters and worked until his hands could no longer hold tools and retired in 1983 at 65 years old. He never spoke publicly about his time as a prisoner. When people asked where he had been during the war, he said Normandy and left it at that. But he told Anna,
late at night when they could not sleep, told her about the lucky star, about the kindness that should not have been possible, about the mercy that changed everything. He told her that the Americans had shown him that humanity survives if we choose to preserve it, that mercy is not weakness, but strength, that what you build matters more than what you destroy. Wilhelm Brenner died in June 1991, age 73, heart failure, peacefully in his sleep. His daughters found the wallet a week later while sorting his belongings, found the coaster inside, faded, fragile, but intact. They asked Anna what it was. Anna told them the story, about their father the prisoner, about the tavern in Oklahoma, about the widow who served beer, about the sergeant who gave the dictionary, about the mercy that should not have been possible but was, about the coaster that their father had carried for 45 years as a reminder that even in the worst circumstances, even between the worst enemies, humanity could survive if people chose to preserve it. The daughters donated the coaster to the Bavarian Army Museum in 1992. The museum created a small exhibit, German POWs in Allied captivity, the coaster in a glass case, Wilhelm's photographs, the dictionary, the napkin, the newspaper clipping, written testimony from Anna about his post-war life. Most visitors walk past without stopping. One more World War II artifact among thousands, a small piece of cardboard with a tavern name printed in fading black ink. But it is not just cardboard. It is proof that on October 14, 1944, 9 German prisoners walked into an American tavern and drank beer with their enemies, that Edith Calloway chose mercy even though her husband had died at Pearl Harbor, that Dalton Hayes paid forward the kindness his father received in Kentucky 30 years earlier, that Edgar Patterson played Silent Night while Germans and Americans sang the same song in different languages. Proof that humanity survived because people chose to preserve it. Wilhelm Brenner carried that coaster for 45 years, through starvation in Munich's ruins, through rebuilding a destroyed nation, through raising daughters and building a company, through moments when hatred would have been easier than hope. He kept it because it reminded him that the world was more complicated than propaganda claimed, that enemies could become neighbors, that what you build matters more than what you burn. The choice was his. The choice is always ours.